The power of the Divine Mercy Chaplet. In times of pain and illness, have you ever felt your body collapse under the weight of exhaustion, while your spirit silently begged for strength? Have you ever wondered why pain seems to arrive just when you thought your faith was strong enough? Have you noticed how illness not only touches the flesh, but also exposes the deepest corners of the soul? When the body cries, something greater begins to happen inside. The noise of the world fades, and the voice of the soul grows louder, clearer, desperate to be heard by the one who never stops listening. Pain becomes a teacher, revealing what comfort once hid. In suffering, masks fall away. Pride, hurry, self-sufficiency, all lose their power when weakness enters the room. Suddenly, we see who we really are, creatures utterly dependent on the mercy of God. It is in those fragile hours, when medicine brings no relief and silence feels endless, that the Divine Mercy Chaplet becomes more than a devotion. It becomes breath. Every repetition of "Have mercy on us and on the whole world" begins to echo the rhythm of your own heart, aligning your suffering with the suffering of Christ. It is as if your pain finds its place within His wounds, and His wounds begin to heal yours. The soul, once burdened by questions, starts to understand that the body's fragility is not a curse, but an invitation. The invitation to meet God not in triumph, but in truth. When the body can do no more, the soul begins to remember what really matters. The chaplet does not promise that suffering will vanish. It promises that no suffering is wasted. Every tear becomes a drop of intercession for those who suffer alone. Every sigh unites you with millions who whisper the same plea in hospital rooms, in grief, in loneliness. You are not alone. You are part of a vast communion of souls who know that mercy is stronger than pain. In that awareness, the soul begins to awaken, to feel not abandoned but chosen, not destroyed but transformed. Through the rhythm of prayer, something mysterious takes place. The body trembles, yet the spirit stands. The words of the chaplet, flowing like a sacred river, wash through the bitterness of fear. Slowly, peace replaces panic. You start to sense that healing does not always mean recovery. Sometimes it means revelation. The revelation that God has been beside you all along, not as a distant observer, but as the one who suffers with you. He enters your darkness not to explain it, but to fill it with His presence. The deeper you enter the prayer, the clearer the voice of mercy becomes. It tells you that every pain has a purpose, even when you cannot see it. It teaches you to trust, not because life is easy, but because God is faithful. When the body cries, it does not betray you. It calls heaven's attention. It reminds you that you were never meant to carry this alone. In your weakest hour, the soul becomes strongest, because it has nothing left to cling to but grace. That is where the Divine Mercy begins its greatest work, not by removing suffering, but by turning it into a meeting place between the human heart and the heart of God. The hour of silence. When God seems far. Why does heaven grow quiet when you need it most? Why does prayer sometimes feel like an echo that returns unanswered? Why, in moments of greatest pain, does God appear to withdraw His voice? Every believer eventually faces this sacred silence, and though it feels like absence, it is a divine invitation. The hour of silence is not God's rejection, it is His most mysterious form of presence. When He hides, it is never to abandon, but to purify the heart that seeks Him. In illness, when every effort fails and the noise of the world fades, that silence becomes a mirror. You begin to see your faith for what it truly is, Not a collection of words, but the courage to trust when you can no longer feel. The Divine Mercy Chaplet becomes a guide through this silence. You whisper the same plea over and over, and though heaven seems quiet, something begins to change within you. The repetition becomes surrender. The stillness becomes strength. It is as if each prayer builds a bridge across the void, a bridge that your heart crosses long before your body can follow. In those moments, you realize that silence is not empty. It is full of unseen mercy working in secret. God's silence is the space where grace takes shape, unseen yet real, preparing your soul for what words could never reveal. When pain deepens, doubt tries to speak louder. You ask, "Has God forgotten me?" Yet the chaplet teaches a different rhythm. It teaches you to breathe faith when every sign of hope fades. The prayer, "For the sake of his sorrowful passion," becomes more than a phrase. It becomes a reminder that Jesus too knew silence. On the cross, he cried out and heard nothing back, yet he kept trusting. That is the silence you are invited into, not the silence of abandonment, but of union. The same silence that once surrounded Calvary now surrounds you, not to wound you, but to mold you into the image of trust itself. When you stay in that silence long enough, something shifts. You begin to feel not the absence of God, but his nearness without sound. His mercy no longer needs to shout. It simply rests over you like light on broken glass. The body still aches, but the soul no longer trembles. The silence becomes a sanctuary where you learn to listen differently, to feel instead of hear, to believe instead of demand. In this sacred stillness, the heart learns that God's love does not depend on emotion or evidence. It is constant, even when unseen. The hour of silence is where the soul matures. It learns that prayer is not a transaction, but a relationship. You do not pray to make God move. You pray to stay near him while he works. And in that nearness, trust grows. The Divine Mercy Chaplet becomes your anchor, keeping you steady in the quiet sea of uncertainty. When God seems far, he is in fact drawing you deeper, teaching you to love him not for his miracles, but for his presence alone. When words fail, silence becomes worship. When heaven is quiet, mercy is still speaking. And when you keep praying, even in the dark, your faith becomes the light that pierces it. Mercy in the shadows of despair. Have you ever reached a point where hope felt impossible to hold? When every prayer seemed to vanish into the void, and you wondered if God still remembered your name? Despair is a darkness that creeps in slowly. It begins with fatigue, grows with disappointment, and finally convinces the soul that mercy no longer exists. Yet it is precisely there, in that shadow, that the Divine Mercy Chaplet reveals its quiet power. The world may see despair as the end, but God sees it as the threshold where mercy begins to work unseen. When you are too weak to fight and too tired to speak, this prayer becomes your breath. It keeps faith alive when emotion has died. The repetition of "Have mercy on us" carries more than words. It carries surrender. It becomes the cry of a wounded soul offering its pain to the one who can transform it. Mercy enters through the cracks of despair, like light seeping into a closed room. It does not erase suffering instantly. It teaches the soul to see differently. What once looked like punishment begins to look like purification. What once felt like loss begins to feel like offering. In those hidden hours when no one understands, the chaplet becomes a lifeline tied directly to the heart of Jesus. Despair isolates, but mercy gathers. Each time you pray, you are not alone. Your voice joins countless others crying out across the world, weaving a tapestry of intercession that reaches heaven. This unity in suffering is sacred. It reminds you that mercy is not limited to those who feel strong or holy. It belongs to the broken, the forgotten, the ones who whisper prayers through tears. And when that realization takes root, despair begins to lose its grip. The same shadow that once suffocated your heart becomes the veil through which light begins to pierce. The power of the Divine Mercy Chaplet lies in this paradox. It turns weakness into strength and emptiness into offering. You discover that mercy is not given because you deserve it. It is given because God cannot stop loving. Even in silence, even in darkness, His mercy moves toward you like the tide returning to the shore. The prayer, "For the sake of His sorrowful passion," draws your suffering into His own, not to erase it, but to sanctify it. Despair has no power when the heart learns to echo those words with trust. In the shadows of despair, the soul learns its deepest truth. Hope is not a feeling. It is a decision. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the courage to believe through fear. The chaplet teaches that you do not have to be strong to pray. You only have to be willing. And as you continue, something unseen awakens. The heart begins to trust again. The tears that once fell from hopelessness now fall in surrender. The light of mercy rises, and though your circumstances may not yet change, your soul already has. You begin to see that the greatest miracle of mercy is not the removal of pain, but the resurrection of faith within it. The wound that becomes a door. Have you ever wondered why God allows pain to touch the very places you thought were protected? Why certain wounds never seem to heal as quickly as you pray for? Pain challenges every certainty, stripping the soul until only truth remains. Yet hidden within every wound lies a secret passage, a doorway through which divine grace enters. The very place where you bleed becomes the place where God begins to rebuild you. It is not punishment, it is transformation. The Divine Mercy Chaplet leads you through that passage, showing that what seems like breaking is often the moment heaven draws nearest. When suffering pierces the heart, the human instinct is to close it, to protect, to retreat. But the chaplet invites the opposite movement, to open, to trust, to let mercy flow through the wound instead of resisting it. The pain you carry becomes prayer in motion. Every word you speak in faith turns the wound into an altar. "Have mercy on us and on the whole world" becomes not just intercession, but participation in the mystery of Christ's own suffering. You begin to understand that Jesus does not stand outside your pain. He stands within it, waiting to meet you there. A wound can be a doorway or a wall. The choice is in how you see it. If you close it with anger or despair, it festers. But when you let the chaplet enter that space, it becomes luminous. Through the rhythm of prayer, the wound opens to grace, allowing the Spirit to breathe again. The world teaches that healing comes when pain ends, but the Gospel teaches something deeper. Healing begins when pain is offered. This is the mystery of divine mercy, that God does not erase wounds, but fills them with Himself, turning every scar into a testimony of love. Each repetition of the chaplet is a step through that sacred door. As you pray, the wound that once symbolized weakness becomes the place of encounter. You realize that God uses suffering not to destroy, but to draw His children closer to the truth of His heart. There is a moment when the wound stops defining you and starts refining you. That is the threshold where grace and pain coexist, and mercy begins to pour like living water. If you look closely at the life of Christ, you'll see that his wounds never disappeared after the resurrection. They remained, not as signs of defeat, but as eternal doors of redemption. The divine mercy flows from those very wounds, open, radiant, unending. Your wounds can mirror his when you let them remain open to mercy, not closed by bitterness. This is the secret language of the soul that has learned to trust. It understands that the same place where pain entered can become the very place where peace begins. The wound that becomes a door is not beautiful at first. It hurts. It burns. It asks everything of you. But when you keep praying the chaplet through tears and silence, that door slowly opens wider. And on the other side, you find not explanations, but presence. You find the God who does not promise a life without pain, but a heart that never suffers alone. The wound no longer separates you from him, it unites you. It becomes the path by which mercy finds you again and again, until you realize that the wound itself has become the proof of his love. Between tears and beads, the hidden power of each prayer. What happens when your tears fall faster than your words? When emotion overtakes every attempt to pray, and you no longer know what to say to God? That is when the Divine Mercy Chaplet becomes more than prayer. It becomes language for the soul that can no longer speak. Between each bead lies a mystery, a heartbeat of trust that carries your pain to the heart of Christ. The rhythm of the chaplet was not made for moments of strength, but for moments when strength has vanished. Every repetition, every whisper, every sigh is gathered by heaven, turned into grace, and returned as peace. There is a sacred harmony hidden within this prayer. While the world rushes, the chaplet slows you down. Its pace invites the soul to breathe again, to align its pulse with the mercy that flows from the cross. When you say, "For the sake of his sorrowful passion," you are not repeating empty words. You are joining a sacred conversation that began at Calvary. The same mercy that poured from Christ's side continues to flow through this prayer, cleansing hearts, restoring faith, and healing wounds no medicine can reach. Each bead becomes a vessel of that mercy, carrying not just your suffering, but the suffering of countless others who pray in silence across the world. Sometimes people imagine prayer as something grand, filled with eloquence and emotion, but the chaplet proves otherwise. It shows that the simplest plea, offered with faith, can move the heavens. Tears are not a sign of weakness, but of depth. They are the body's way of releasing what the soul cannot express. God does not overlook them. He collects them. Every tear that falls while you hold the chaplet becomes part of the offering. Prayer and pain merge, creating something holy. A love that asks for nothing but His will to be done. In those quiet minutes between each bead, you begin to sense the living presence of mercy surrounding you. It is as if the prayer itself carries you when your voice trembles. The repetition softens the mind's noise and leads you into stillness, where God's voice becomes audible not through sound, but through peace. You realize that you do not need to feel strong for the prayer to work. The chaplet draws its power not from emotion, but from intention, from the decision to keep trusting even when the heart feels dry. This is the hidden power of the chaplet. It transforms the ordinary act of repetition into an encounter with the extraordinary. It teaches that prayer is not about changing God's mind, but about letting His mercy change your heart. With every bead you pass through your fingers, something invisible happens. Fear loosens. Resentment fades. Hope stirs again. The rhythm of the prayer cleanses the soul like waves on the shore, each one washing away what no one else can see. Between tears and beads, faith is reborn. The chaplet turns weakness into offering, sorrow into surrender. It becomes the rope that pulls you out of despair, the bridge that carries you across the silence, the melody that reminds you of heaven's patience. You may not notice it at first, but the more you pray, the more you become part of its rhythm, the rhythm of mercy beating in union with Christ's own heart. That is where transformation begins, not in the noise of miracles, but in the quiet power of a soul that keeps praying even through tears. When healing begins before the cure. Have you ever felt peace before the situation changed? Have you ever noticed how, in the middle of suffering, something inside begins to heal even when the body still aches? True healing does not always arrive in the form of recovery. It often begins as a quiet transformation of the heart. The Divine Mercy Chaplet teaches this truth better than any sermon. As you pray, you realize that the miracle of mercy often starts before the cure, when the soul finally surrenders its will and allows God to take control. Healing begins the moment trust replaces fear, when your heart stops demanding and starts receiving. When illness or pain steals your strength, it is natural to ask for relief. But the chaplet shifts the focus from the body to the soul. It leads you to the place where healing begins, not in the flesh, but in the spirit that learns to say, "Jesus, I trust in you." Those words are more powerful than any medicine because they do not depend on outcome. They create space within the soul for grace to work freely. The moment you surrender your suffering into His hands, something changes. You may not feel it immediately, but heaven does. A deep calm begins to settle inside, a peace that has no explanation except mercy itself. Many people mistake healing for escape, but the chaplet shows that healing is communion. When you unite your pain with the passion of Christ, your suffering no longer isolates you. It connects you. It becomes part of the divine work of redemption. Every breath, every tear, every whispered prayer becomes meaningful. The weight of pain does not disappear, but its purpose does. It turns from burden to offering. This is the miracle before the miracle, the moment when the soul realizes that it is already being renewed from within. Healing before the cure is not about ignoring pain. It is about transforming its power. It is the realization that suffering can no longer dictate your peace. When you pray the chaplet with sincerity, you begin to see that what truly needs healing is not always the body. It is the fear, the anger, the doubt that have taken root within. God works quietly, dissolving the hardness of the heart, teaching it to forgive, to hope, to love again. This inner restoration is the soil where physical healing may later grow. But even if it does not, the soul has already found freedom. There are moments during the prayer when nothing seems to change externally. The illness remains, the pain continues, the future is uncertain. Yet you feel a strength rising within that was not there before. That is the invisible work of divine mercy. The chaplet is like a spiritual surgery that touches what doctors cannot reach: the wounds of the spirit, the fatigue of faith, the loneliness of suffering. It restores dignity to the one who feels forgotten, reminding them that they are never unseen by God. When healing begins before the cure, you learn to measure life differently. You stop asking, "When will this end?" and start asking, "What is God teaching me here?" You begin to perceive beauty even in fragility, purpose even in pain. The body may still tremble, but the soul stands firm. Peace, the rarest form of healing, takes root, and everything else begins to align around it. The Divine Mercy Chaplet is not a formula for miracles. It is the place where the greatest miracle happens first. The healing of the heart that dares to trust before it sees the cure. The cross that heals from within. Have you ever wondered why the cross, a symbol of suffering, became the sign of hope for all humanity? How can something so painful bring healing to the soul? The answer lies in the mystery of divine love. The cross is not merely a reminder of death. It is the revelation of mercy that transforms every pain into redemption. When you hold the Divine Mercy Chaplet and whisper its words with faith, you are not escaping the cross. You are entering into it. You are standing beside Christ, letting His wounds touch yours, and discovering that through that union, a different kind of healing begins. One that restores not just the body, but the meaning of life itself. Many try to flee from the cross, believing that faith should spare them from suffering. But Christ never promised escape. He promised presence. The cross is the place where heaven and earth meet, where pain is not erased but transfigured. The Divine Mercy Chaplet draws you into that mystery. Every word, for the sake of His sorrowful passion, reminds you that pain itself has been sanctified. When you repeat those words, you are not simply recalling what He endured. You are participating in it. You are allowing His suffering to merge with yours, transforming despair into intercession and weakness into a source of grace. When you look at the cross through the eyes of faith, it stops being a symbol of loss and becomes a fountain of healing. The same wood that held His body now holds the weight of your pain. His wounds are not closed. They remain open to pour mercy into yours. The chaplet becomes the key that unlocks that flow. You begin to realize that each repetition is like tracing your fingers along the cross, not in defeat, but in communion. You are not praying to be removed from suffering. You are praying to be filled with meaning inside it. This is where true healing takes place, from within. The cross heals not by taking pain away, but by giving it purpose. It reveals that love is stronger than agony, and surrender is more powerful than resistance. Through the chaplet, your own crosses, illness, loneliness, disappointment, become connected to His. You begin to see that there is no suffering too deep for mercy to reach, no night too long for grace to enter. What was once unbearable becomes sacred because you no longer carry it alone. The more you pray, the more you feel that the cross is not just a distant memory. It lives within you. The same mercy that flowed from His pierced side now flows through your heart. It heals quietly, invisibly, but profoundly. You discover that your suffering, when united with Christ, no longer breaks you. It redeems you. It gives birth to compassion, patience, and understanding that only those who have suffered can possess. That is why the cross is not the end. It is the beginning of resurrection. The cross that heals from within is not about avoiding the wounds of life, but allowing them to become channels of grace. When you look at Christ crucified and pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet, you are saying, I accept to be healed through you, not apart from you. And in that moment, the miracle happens. The cross stops being a weight you drag and becomes the place where you finally rest. You understand that mercy is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of God within it. The cross, once feared, becomes your source of strength. your proof that love can turn even pain into salvation. The invisible battle. Faith versus fear. Have you ever felt faith and fear fighting inside you at the same time? That quiet battle that begins in the heart when you want to believe but pain keeps whispering that God has forgotten you? Every soul that suffers knows this struggle. It is invisible to others, yet it determines everything. Faith calls you to trust in what you cannot see, while fear drags you back into what you can. The Divine Mercy Chaplet was given for this battlefield. It is not a prayer of escape. It is a weapon of peace. It does not deny fear's existence, but it refuses to let fear win. Each repetition becomes an act of resistance, a declaration that mercy is greater than terror. In the silence of suffering, fear takes many shapes. It disguises itself as doubt, anxiety, or the feeling of being unworthy of God's love. It whispers that prayer is useless, that you are alone. But faith answers quietly through the chaplet. For the sake of his sorrowful passion, have mercy on us. That single phrase is like a shield, reminding the soul that fear can only speak lies, while mercy speaks truth. The more you pray, the more that truth begins to take root inside you. The heart that once trembled starts to breathe differently, to stand firmer, to see pain not as punishment, but as invitation. The real battle is not around you, but within you. It happens in the small choices, the choice to pray instead of despair, to forgive instead of resent, to trust instead of accuse. Faith is not noise, it is a quiet persistence that keeps the soul standing when everything else collapses. The chaplet gives rhythm to that persistence. It transforms panic into prayer and worry into worship. The same words that once felt repetitive become your armor. They steady your heart, align your mind, and lift your spirit out of the storm. When fear tries to rule, it isolates. It convinces you that no one understands, that your pain is too heavy, that God is distant. But mercy connects. It gathers every wounded heart into one great act of intercession. When you pray the chaplet, you are not alone. You are joining a universal chorus of souls choosing faith over fear. And even when you cannot feel God, He feels you. Every trembling word you offer becomes a light in the unseen realm, pushing back the shadows that try to suffocate hope. Faith does not silence fear instantly. It teaches you how to live above it. The chaplet does not remove the storm, but it reminds you who calms it. With every repetition, your soul learns a new rhythm, the rhythm of surrender. You realize that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear define your reality. When you pray, "Jesus, I trust in you," it is not a slogan. It is a decision made in the middle of battle, a decision that rewrites the outcome. The invisible battle between faith and fear never truly ends in this life, but through mercy, you learn how to fight without losing peace. You discover that fear can shake the body, but not touch the soul anchored in prayer. Each word of the chaplet becomes a step away from fear and toward divine confidence. The victory is not loud. It is quiet, deep, eternal. It is the moment when your heart chooses to trust, even while trembling. And that choice, repeated again and again, becomes your triumph. In that hidden battlefield, mercy wins, not by destroying fear, but by transforming it into the doorway through which faith is reborn. The whisper of miracles. Have you ever noticed that the greatest miracles rarely come with noise or spectacle? That sometimes what changes your life most profoundly arrives in silence, almost unnoticed. The world expects miracles to shine, to be visible proofs of divine power. But the Divine Mercy Chaplet teaches a deeper truth. The real miracles of mercy are often quiet. They appear not as sudden cures or visible signs, but as transformations within the soul. Moments of peace, forgiveness, and surrender that alter the entire direction of a life. Mercy does not shout, it whispers. And those who pray learn to listen. When you begin to pray the chaplet regularly, you start to perceive these whispers. A fear that once dominated you begins to lose its hold. A memory that once caused pain slowly softens. A relationship once broken begins to mend without explanation. These are not coincidences. They are the gentle fingerprints of divine mercy at work. God rarely moves in the way the human heart demands, but always in the way it most needs. The miracle often begins the moment you stop trying to control and start to trust. That is why the chaplet is not merely a plea for intervention. It is an act of surrender that opens space for grace to act freely. Miracles happen where faith and patience meet. The repetition of "Have mercy on us" trains the heart to wait without despair. Each word builds endurance in the soul, a capacity to see beyond what the eyes can register. Sometimes you may not notice the miracle while it unfolds. Only later, looking back, you realize how mercy redirected what once seemed lost. The problem that tormented you may still exist, but you no longer face it the same way. The change within you becomes the proof that God was moving all along. That is the subtle power of mercy. It changes the person before it changes the situation. The whisper of miracles is not bound by human logic. It works in hidden ways, through unseen alignments and quiet interventions that appear ordinary until faith interprets them. The sick may find sudden strength to endure. The anxious may sleep peacefully for the first time in years. The one consumed by grief may discover gratitude rising from pain. None of these moments make headlines, yet they are the true currency of heaven, the daily miracles that sustain the weary and restore the broken. The chaplet opens the door for them, not because it forces God's hand, but because it opens the human heart wide enough to receive. Miracles are not rewards for perfection. They are consequences of trust. When you pray through suffering and refuse to let despair win, heaven responds. Not always with what you asked for, but always with what you need. The whisper of miracles moves quietly through that trust, turning what looks like failure into testimony, and what feels like silence into song. And when that happens, the heart begins to understand. Every breath of mercy is itself a miracle. You no longer wait for extraordinary signs, because you have learned to recognize the extraordinary presence of God in the ordinary moments of life. From suffering to resurrection. The triumph of mercy. Have you ever imagined that the pain you carry could become the very path to your resurrection? That within every suffering lies the seed of a greater life, waiting to rise? The Divine Mercy Chaplet reveals this mystery. It teaches that pain is not the final word, because mercy always has the power to transform the ending. Suffering, when offered through the cross, does not destroy, it purifies. It clears the heart of illusions and opens it to eternity. What once felt like the end becomes a beginning, because mercy never leaves a wound without purpose. Through prayer, the tomb of despair becomes the cradle of renewal, and the soul discovers that nothing is truly lost when it is surrendered to God. Every "Have mercy on us," whispered in pain, builds a bridge between death and resurrection. The body may remain weak, but the spirit begins to rise. The chaplet becomes the rhythm of rebirth, each repetition an act of faith declaring that darkness does not win. Even when healing does not come as you expected, a deeper healing unfolds within. You begin to understand that resurrection is not only a moment after death, it is a process that begins now, in every heart that dares to trust while bleeding. It is the mystery of divine mercy turning agony into glory, transforming fear into peace and filling silence with divine promise. The world measures victory by strength, but heaven measures it by surrender. The one who kneels with faith in the middle of suffering already shares in Christ's triumph. When you pray the chaplet with a heart open to mercy, you are not begging for rescue. You are participating in resurrection itself. You are saying, "Jesus, I trust in you," not as resignation, but as rebirth. That trust breaks the chains of despair and allows light to enter where none seemed possible. The cross that once felt unbearable becomes the foundation of hope, and pain turns into proof of love. The triumph of mercy is not a dramatic reversal of fortune, but a quiet revolution of the heart. It changes how you see everything. You begin to perceive grace even in struggle, presence even in silence, and love even in loss. The same mercy that raised Christ from the grave begins to raise you from your sorrow, your fear, your doubt. It teaches that no suffering is wasted, because every act of trust becomes a spark of resurrection that heaven sees. The chaplet turns those sparks into fire, a fire that refines, comforts, and restores. One day you will look back and realize that what once felt like the darkest chapter was actually the turning point. The prayer you whispered through tears became the song of your victory. The suffering you thought would break you became the place where God's mercy proved strongest. That is resurrection, not only the rising of Christ, but the rising of your soul into the fullness of His love. The Divine Mercy Chaplet is the path through which that miracle unfolds. It begins in the valley of pain and ends at the dawn of eternal peace, where every wound is healed, every tear is known, and every heart finally rests in the embrace of the one who makes all things new.